I think I'm actually going to hold off because there's just more I want to figure out before I bring it to this
Okay,
group.
I'll put you in the future. And John, you had a topic last time. I don't want to, skip it unless you don't want to discuss it. I think it's about like a controller, a waypoint controller in the election or something like that.
John, step away. He mentioned it in the chat, so you probably can't hear you.
I'm sorry, Keith, what did you say? It was, you had some background or something.
Sorry, I said John said you step away in the chat. Oh, he's back.
But I didn't hear anything, so.
Oh, okay. So John, you had a topic for last week. I don't want to skip you. Did you not want to discuss about it?
Oh yeah, we already merged that PR, so it's
Oh,
stale.
okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, sounds good. All right, I think the recording is on.
Yep,
Should I
start it.
share my
Please go ahead.
screen? All right, I'll go figure out to share my screen. Works. All right, I think this is a doc, which I think this time I did put in the Google Drive. So hopefully everybody have access to, or what is your community drive should be able to access the doc. If not, do let me know. I'll try to figure out what I did wrong. So basically, I guess Istio 1.18 is coming out soon, right? The next, which we have Ambient will be part of the alpha in 1.18, and this document is intended to socialize ideas around, what do we believe is driving ambient mesh to beta. So this is certainly going to be a very community effort. I would love feedback from each and every one of you to see if the list makes sense as a starting point. And certainly there's a lot of work, as you can see. So definitely, welcome owners, people willing to sign up and, move forward with many of these requirements. So at a high level, I'm not going to read the docs. It's kind of break into different categories. I think Ambient API is probably one of the most important one as we are about to reach beta. We do want the API. We have a consensus on the API and hopefully not going to change much at all after beta. So that's number one. Another trend is also how do we get Ambient working beyond single Kubernetes clusters? As part of the alpha, we've been focused primarily on Ambient for single cluster. So there are some desire to, I've heard from multiple team member in the community on how do we get Ambient for multi-network, multi-cluster? What about workloads running on VM? So these are different ideas we had that could be potentially very, very important for beta. And the other thing that I constantly hear people talk about is CNI, right? I think, Ben, you opened the issue. If we run Selim CNI with Ambient right now, Ztano just crashed, if I heard it correctly. If I read it correctly, Calico, how does this compatible with Ambient? So there's a lot of things we need to figure out. Do we work through the network policy or do we just completely ignore the CNI? So we need some message around some of these major CNIs as we declare beta. Trust and security hardening, I think this one is primarily from Louis. Actually, I don't know if Louis is on, if you want to add anything for this.
Louis is not on the call.
Okay, I guess I'll move forward, but it's relative self-explanatory. And then observability, I believe, John, you opened an issue about we need to think out what we do with observability. Costin, I know you are pushing for OTA support in the community too. So this is another area we have to put some focus on to think out, what is our story around observability for beta and what can we do with existing ecosystem projects out there, like Kayali. What about our Grafana dashboard? What about our existing distributed tracing integration with Jaga and potentially even Zipkin? And then testing, of course, from what I know is right now we only run a subset of testing with Ambient. There's like a lot of testing that we use with Sidecast. We are not currently running them with Ambient. So it's going to be important to get many of these testing whenever they are applicable to get them running with Ambient. Is there a comment or question? All right, and then a few other ones that certainly Ambient and Sidecar will need to interrupt because a lot of our users are using Sidecar today. So we have to think out a story for them. We have to think out what is the right path of the migration as they move from Sidecar to without Sidecar to Ambient. What are the documented recommended steps? And also installation, definitely that's another thing, it's under debate. In fact, in the previous meeting about what do we do with the operator controller on the server side, and upgrade, because as when we declare beta, we have to think through, from beta to the next version of beta. If it's beta or production ready, user will need to be able to tell them you can upgrade, hopefully with very minimum downtime. And we definitely need help with documentation. I've heard the feedback. If you go to Istio.io, you actually don't know where Ambient is unless you go to our blog page or, unless you go to preliminary. So when Ambient reach beta, I think it's extremely important to actually have Ambient as part of our landing page so that people know Ambient is also part of Istio. And last but not least, some of the performance testing that we need to do for Ambient as we declare beta. So that is the list we have at the moment. So I would like to kind of open up for any questions.
Lynn, would it make sense to add a section? I can see that a lot of this is about work that we need to do. We also, I think, need to hear back from our users as well in terms of what we've done already, where it works, where it doesn't, etc. Should that be captured here as well, or is that sort of a different type of work?
So I'm trying to think of potentially what type of work are you suggesting?
Well, so traditionally, before we move something from alpha to beta, we get data from our users validating that it is in the shape that they would like to see in beta, because beta represents a commitment to the API and overall shape of the product.
Okay, so it's get feedback, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, if we can. I think we discuss that in TOC on Monday. Am I correct? I don't think we drive consensus, but we discuss there is a desire. We want to collect feedback.
Yeah, I just was asking for the sake of the doc if we should be tracking that there as one of the gates for graduation to beta. It's in process. We are actively soliciting feedback. I expect that we will get feedback and hopefully it's positive and we can just go to beta. But if either the feedback is negative or if we're unable to collect feedback, then we probably ought to pump the brakes on beta.
Hey, Mitch, how are you facilitating that feedback?
Phil, I would love your help with that. Actually, if you want to chat about it, okay. I've got plans on a survey that's going to go out. We're also going to be conducting a end user summit in late July, where we're specifically asking for users who have done a more than trivial test of Ambient, like maybe a development or staging environment, to come and give feedback in something like a 2-hour Q&A session. But I'm working on the details and could use all the help I could get.
Yeah, I think this is a great thing to have for beta, and I don't know if we would block beta for it because it's unclear to me if we would get much feedback for alpha. You know what I mean? Just because alpha is not production ready, I don't know if we'll get sufficient feedback.
I put a comment as well on the doc. I think it, have huge API surfaces and huge products moving to beta at once. It's both dangerous and very likely to not be able to focus on all the things and will take forever. A much more practical approach is to break it down and to split it into independent features. For example, CNI plus Z-tunnel as standalone components could move to beta or could move independently. And again, since we expect CNI to be maybe merged with upstream CNIs or combined or provided by a provider, maybe something that is decoupled from Istio itself. Workload discovery service is something that Quad is starting to use for regular sidecars and could be something that we promote to beta much sooner because workload discovery service is pretty straightforward and independent of Ambient. And the list can go on. I mean, we can have the new authorization API, for example, released sooner because it, as far as I know, it applies to both sidecars and to Ambient. So it will be much better to not have one big Ambient blob, but to have a list of distinct features that can move at different speeds. And obviously, workload discovery service is probably one of the first things that we should enable by default in Istio and have it on because it's super safe and the most useful independent of the rest.
Yeah, I think there's no disagreement if small features could be promoted to beta if they are ready. But I do think users are looking at us. Is Ambient Mesh beta, right? That's the question the user would ask. They're not going to ask us, hey, by the way, did you have the workload XDS implemented for sidecar? Is that feature beta? They wouldn't know that question to ask, and that they probably care less because it's so internal control plane to data plane API.
Yeah, no, it will be better when all the components are beta, of course, but we can have them test workload discovery service, for example, in the next release because we just need to enable by default and start using it for telemetry, or we can have complete testing for individual features separate from and when all the things are beta, obviously the whole will be beta, but at least people can give feedback on individual things like HBone and other things. Anyway, I think we are on the same page.
Yeah.
The one thing I want to clarify, I mentioned this a couple of months ago, but I think we need to really try to be careful about how we're referring about Ambient in with respect to feature status. I kind of loosely agree, at least in part with Costin here, because I see things on the beta list like workload, VMs and multi-network and things like that. And I think that Ambient, we decided that Ambient is the architecture. I think architecture reaching beta is a distinct conversation from that architecture having feature parity with what exists inside Istio. And if the goal is to try to get the architecture in beta by next release, I think that's probably a lot more feasible if we focus on the core things necessary for the architecture rather than things like multi-network in VMs that can come into beta in their own time. Does that make sense? What do people think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like there's a core use case, right? And then there's an extended set of use cases. I mean, Lynn's right, that when we talk to an end user and tell them that Ambient's ready and then qualify the statement, the qualifications have to be things that make sense to the user, right? Because, right, like we can have a hidden feature, right, for the workload discovery API to improve telemetry experience, custom and scale, or the derivatives of it. But we can't really talk to the user, or like that's not a product, in the sense that users would consume it. So like we can have a more narrow definition of the ambient core and define it as working for beta than everything in Istio working, but we still have to think about how to express that in terms of features, not infrastructure.
Completely agree, Louis. And I think you hit the point here. How is it expressed to users? What will the user see when Ambient is available? They will see the network is secure. They will see some metadata service APIs that allows them to get access to the credentials, which is probably like required. And they will see waypoints. Is there anything else that matters from a user except that, hey, if I create a gateway type waypoint, it will be intercepted, it will go through, and I know that the network is secure.
Well, if I'm a customer and I'm multi-cluster, I'm going to care if Ambient works with multi-cluster or not. If that multi-cluster implies multiple networks, I'm going to care, right? Because it's going to limit my ability to test it, right?
Sure.
If I can't target those things. So we have to say, like, because those are features, right? Which of those features are in scope for beta and which are out, or which have reached beta level quality and which have not.
Yeah,
Right?
completely.
Like ambient single cluster could be beta.
Exactly.
Ambient for multi-cluster or multi-network could be alpha, and that like users could parse that.
Yep.
They can't parse the workload discovery XDS API, I don't think.
No, but internally, I mean, from our perspective and tactical.
Oh, sure, we can.
Yep.
But you know that's not going to affect, like, because beta is at the point at which users are going to make adoption decisions or qualification decisions. Right? So we have to speak their language at that point.
Yeah.
I know in the past.
So I guess.
Go ahead, Louis.
I was just going to say we need to define a feature matrix.
Well, and that word matrix, I think, is relevant here. In the past, we've been hesitant to expose a maturity matrix because of the sheer cardinality of Istio features. However, if we limit the cardinality of one dimension to sidecar and ambient, then it gets to be something that a user could consume relatively quickly. We could scan down a list of 12 to 20 features that already work to some degree in sidecar that maybe they're using, and evaluate whether ambient is a good choice for them.
Maybe I was not very clear with my API comment. I think defining the API surface and where the API applies is probably the most important thing for users. That's what I was trying to say. I mean, hey, we have this set of APIs that are supported. The APIs are beta, obviously. And as Louis said, you can use them in single cluster, you can add VMs, you can add, but that's kind of an implementation detail, which we can explain separately. I mean, but from a user perspective, that's what they interact with the system, that's the guarantees we make. And then we can tell the environments where this thing works or doesn't work. I don't think we need to, I mean, it will be better to separate this thing. And we have compatibility test suites for the API, maybe for the Gamma and Gateway API, which we are using. There's a rather test and clear definition of when an implementation is beta or compatible from waypoint, at least point perspective. And the rest is probably implementation details that users should not necessarily worry about.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, which is why Ambient API is the first thing on the bullet, right? In order for us to reach beta, the API has to be stable, has to be well communicated. Yeah, and so user wouldn't be surprised.
Okay, so there's an AI for somebody to go off and define this nominal matrix, right?
Wait, so what is the matrix for?
So what are the things that could be taken out of scope or not shipped as beta quality while still shipping Ambient or the core of Ambient at beta? Right now, everything is alpha, right, with Ambient.
Yeah.
If we end up in a situation where we cannot bring everything to beta, but we can bring enough of it to beta. Right? What is that enough of it? Right? We still have to have this notion of core, and then other features. Right? I think we want to say it in terms of code. So like single cluster, right, with no sidecars. So just ambient is the only thing in the cluster. Can we bring that to beta? Single cluster with sidecars, right? So like an upgrade scenario. Single cluster plus VMs, single multi-cluster, and then multi-network. And then there's probably a priority of which of those things is more important. Like it might actually be more important to do multi-cluster than to do sidecars and ambient cohabiting. Or there's at least a debate to be had about the relative value of any one of those two things.
Yeah.
Like, because at least for an upgrade strategy, we could say, look, just uninstall sidecars and then install ambient, right? And we don't support cohabiting. That would be painful for customers who had big existing installations, but it probably wouldn't prevent them from doing a POC if they were standing up a new cluster.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's an example of a trade-off that we could make between trying to qualify one set of features and another.
That's also the benefit of shipping a smaller core, because the big issue with anything being alpha is that you're going to have less adoption. So the sooner we get anything out to beta, even if it's smaller in surface area, we're going to be getting more feedback from users who are able to do POCs because, hey, at least this core piece of the ambient architecture is beta.
And maybe this core could be, just a networking layer, because that's super narrow, super easy to qualify, and much easier to test. Like, basically zTunnel plus CNI providing network security. And another thing is a waypoint, which more or less is independent of the other layers. So the waypoints work with both sidecar and the other, and whatever else, because they're regular gateways.
Right. So we could say that like the features are just MTLS only, MTLS and waypoints are another feature. Now we could still make the decision like both have to be at beta, right, Custom?
Yeah.
But we could separate them in the matrix.
And by the way, shipping MTLS as a feature separated and first, it will enable people to have security across the entire mesh. I mean, enabled by default and all the other nice things. And get a lot of mileage on this.
Right. The problem with MTLS versus waypoints is that's orthogonal to like multi-cluster, multi-network, right?
For single cluster, I mean, if you want to keep enabled by default, it has to be single cluster anyway, and service import is the one that it's.
Okay.
So I think Lynn's doc gets us in a good spot. Sorry, you were about to say the same thing I was going to.
I was about to say the same thing. Go ahead.
I think Lynn's doc gets us in a good spot of seeing what there is that we could push to beta. What remains is that matrix of here are the permutations of things like distant sidecar, like distant ambient, and then we can have that conversation of priorities, and then from there we're able to do what we did for alpha, get it in project boards and start executing on the individual things that we prioritize. That sound about right, Louis?
I think that's fair. In the meanwhile, though, I don't want to stop people who are interested in working on different things, in the community. If there are people, because we know this is like the end goal, we want to have ambient mesh to be beta, and these are the different things we want to be able to, declare beta for the entire ambient, or at least most of the feature of ambient. So if people in the community are interested in working on those items, we'd be happy to have those people starting to help out and working on those. In parallel, we can also start to phase this out, right? Maybe like you guys were mentioning, right? zTunnel with just layer 4 function, just for single cluster is the first phase. And then maybe single cluster is the second phase with layer 4 and layer 7, we can have a phase out approach.
We should treat, there's the there's all the features, right? And anybody, like, we can work on all the things in parallel, that's fine. If we're getting towards the end of the release and even the base feature is not at beta quality, we should probably have a focused effort. But, right, until we get to that kind of like maybe a month before shipping, we have a let many flowers bloom, and if everything gets to beta quality, right, multiple thumbs up.
Right. It really depends on like who is available, be able to help out on different things. Yeah.
Right.
It feels to me, looking at the doc, like if it were to try to get a sense of what those P0 things like would be, where there would be no beta without those things. The APIs feel like the big one, in my opinion, personally. There's the current state of things, and from what I understand, is we've got this Ambient APIs doc, has a lot of things in it, potential changes to destination rule, and things of that nature. Do we have any sort of immediate action items on getting some clarity on those things? Because my concern is that there be additional work that's blocked by not having some of those base things fleshed out.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely work to resolve API ambiguity questions.
Yeah.
I don't know if having let's see whether if there are some stragglers in that would prevent beta versus just saying guidance to the users about what APIs they should use to be considered in beta versus alpha state. Right, that's always a problem with APIs anyway, right? So, but it obviously deserves some time and effort now, right? There's the Gamma stuff and there's the existing APIs, right? There are things in the existing APIs that make no sense for Ambient, and we're going to tell users not to use them. The API doesn't get deleted. The API still exists, right? But maybe that has an impingement on upgrade, right? That cohabiting with sidecars use case. So yeah, there needs to be some active discussion going through the APIs. I know, Costin, you had a wish list of APIs to kill. We can't kill all of them that are on your wish list, but we should be able to get rid of.
John, I don't want to kill anything. I want to keep absolutely everything in the old Istio and use clean APIs in the new Istio. That's
sure, yeah, okay, but
they stay forever.
But like peer authentication policy is a classic example of an API that has different meaning / maybe no meaning in the world of Ambient, right? So we have to take a hard look. The API is not going away, but we'll just tell people not to use it. Is that a reasonable answer for beta? Or do we have to mess with the install as well? Things like that.
And by the way, Gamma and Gateway are probably good answer for a lot of these things, because if we adopt upstream APIs and we tell users to use upstream API, it's a very, very clear signal and very beneficial for the users, because they also kind of can use multiple implementations and are decoupled from Istio semantics. And it's a clear different namespace, CRD, and everything else.
Yeah, but we know we can't walk away from the existing virtual service. We can't walk away from that right now. Like, we have to do both. There's no choice with that part. We can have a 3-year roadmap to deprecate virtual service. We can't have a 6-month roadmap to do.
Not deprecate, but recommend users to use HTTP route whenever possible, use Gateway whenever possible, and so forth. I mean, it's.
I think that's called a soft deprecation custom. All right. So I'm happy to spend some time on the API surface, but I think, Costin, I know you were looking to spend time on it. Keith, obviously you have some interest.
Yeah, I was going to say I can spend some time looking at the API services. If my biggest question is I stepped away from Ambient for a little bit. Is I don't know the current state of the Ambient API stock and how up to date it is. So as long as I can search and find a good understanding of the current state, it should be good to contribute there.
So
okay, yeah, that's good.
yeah, so if API is a priority, I think we should dedicate the next meeting or even this meeting, the remainder of this meeting, to discuss what are the contention points in the Ambient API doc that needs decision, right? Does anyone agree with that?
Yeah, it's,
Okay,
it's pretty
so
important.
yeah, so John, correct me if I'm wrong. I think one of the contention point was authorization policy, right? How we apply authorization policy, particularly from layer 4 move to layer 7, right? How do we keep it the same with today's authorization policy, and are we okay with select a waypoint, or do we use reference binding to bind to the waypoint? I think that's one of the contention point. The other contention point is, do we need peer authentication policy for Ambient? I believe there's actually an outstanding issue for that. There are people saying it's still useful. There are folks saying it's not useful. I don't think we ever made a consensus as a community with that decision. Is there anything else, John, you want to add? That's a contention point for the Ambient API.
No, I think those are the main ones.
Okay, so
Louis,
John,
are
do you
you
wanna-
updated to, John, should we take the team through the contention point now?
Yeah, I mean, we can go through that.
are we hijacking the agenda in
are.
any way, or?
Yeah.
No, this is the only thing on the agenda is
Okay,
to
then.
driving to
Okay.
beta, right? Driving the beta, then most important is the API, yes. So John, do you want me to present, or do you want to present?
Sure, I'm having trouble finding it.
Okay, I'll try share my screen again. Right. Okay, so this is the Ambient API document, which you guys can find it through previous meeting minutes. Just search Ambient API. I believe, so one of the idea in this document is the way to bind the authorization policy to a waypoint is through, I think what Gamma normally is through a parent ref, where you specify, you're binding to a particular waypoint, and I believe this should map to the name of the waypoint as you deploy your waypoint. So that essentially means I expect this authorization policy to be enforced by this given waypoint. So that's one of the proposal out there for layer 7 authorization policy. I believe for alpha, what we implemented is not this. So what we implemented in the code base, if we have an example, maybe we don't have an example here. So yeah, I can describe what we implemented. So basically what we implemented in alpha, John, correct me if I'm wrong, is the authorization policy where we ask you to select, to do a label selector on your waypoint. So instead of using parent ref, you would use workload selector, and then you would specify the label to select the waypoint.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was implemented intended to be implemented as a stopgap before we implemented this. The main reason we didn't do this, I think, was there was some hesitation. I think we mostly agreed on this. There's just some hesitation because doing this means making an API change to basically every single Istio API. which is a somewhat scary idea, especially for Ambient, which was pre-alpha at the time. So
Yeah, and particularly for user using Sidecar today, right? That means they have to rewrite their authorization policy for layer 7. And also, I think, John, the other thing that's a little bit different is because also if you're using layer 4 authorization policy, you would use the selector here. So, so basically that means we're inconsistency between layer 4 and layer 7 authorization policy. So that could be another thing that's very confusing for the user, because as a user, they could start with a simple rule like this, but not having a layer 7 portion. And when they move to layer 7, they kind of have to change the select to parent ref, which I think is not very intuitive.
2 points or 3 points here. If we want to have a proper support for Gamma gateway and vendor model, I think we need to do this for Istio anyway, because that's how you properly attach policies in gateway and Gamma. So I don't think this is specific to Ambient. It's something we need to do for everything. It's backward compatible, so users don't have to change anything at all. It's just new fields that can be added to a CRD in a backward compatible way. So I think we should move ahead with this across the board, starting with regular Istio. So it applies to gateways, and Waypoint is a gateway. So and let's solve this problem first. But I am very, very reluctant to have attached to gateway as a whole, because the gateway may have multiple ports, may have multiple routes. It's what we had before with applying the route at the top level and then doing double routing is not ideal. And Kubernetes, Envoy has ability to attach authorization policies to routes, so we can do better than what we had before. So basically, we need a section, and we need some way maybe to attach to routes or to higher level. But other than that, I don't think it's a problem, because that's APIs that Kubernetes defines.
But the route API are not defined here, right? They are part of the HTTP route.
So I'm saying parent ref should include at least the listener. So if you have a gateway with multiple listeners, because this is not only for Waypoint, it's also for regular.
Oh,
gateways.
okay. Okay.
And maybe the host name or some more detailed thing, because if you have a multiple, in order to make it upstream basic, to have a common API between Istio and Ambient.
I think Keith, you were next.
Yeah, I don't know that we have a compatibility issue as far as changing every Istio installation, because I think as Kakin said, it's just a new field. So that parent ref can be used for anything for Ambient, and people can continue using their existing authorization policies until they move to Ambient. The thing that does concern me, though, is the L4 authorization policy approach, where I do agree it's a bit confusing to have to translate from parent ref to workload selector. Is there anything can technically be a parent ref? So maybe it would be there's something we could do to bind to create a resource or something. But I do agree that that's not ideal to have to change the field you use depending on what layer that you're using in the same resource.
So one thing to clarify, and this is probably just a pedantic wording thing, is it's not L4 policies use label selector. It's policies applied at ztunnel versus policies applied at the waypoint. You can apply L4 policies at the waypoint. And by L4 policies, I mean policies that only use L4 attributes, right? I think you probably meant that, but just in case anyone else was confused.
Yeah, that's a good clarification.
My other comment,
Yeah.
Austin, I don't want to commit to agreeing, but I somewhat agree with your HTTP route binding thing. Is that I view that as something that can be completely added later potentially. Do they need to be coupled, or is that did you view it that way as well?
I don't know. Long term, I mean, part of the API, we should make sure that we leave room for section name. Definitely, we need it soon. But section name should be extensible in a way to attach to routes, because again, you have a host with 10,000 routes, you only have to put authorization policy on a route. We shouldn't perpetuate the current implementation details of double routing.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess like hypothetically, if today I go submit an API PR, do you think it needs to have HTTP route support, or we just need to be able to add it later, which we could?
I think we can already by liberal interpretation of section or some
But
other.
no, it wouldn't be section for route. It would be kind route, right?
That's fine too. It's part of the state. Kind is whatever you want. It's not necessarily that we support, but it needs to be parent ref with section and everything else.
Yeah, section name would be for referring to a listener within the gateway.
Yes, or a route within a HTTP route. That's
a route within a route. Yeah. Actually, I don't know if the last one they added name. Well, maybe. Anyhow, yes, that's how it would be used. Yeah.
Yeah, but basically just add section name. So if we can make an API change today, and we add this parent ref to the API and implement it for Istio, we can move it to beta much faster and independent of everything else.
Okay. Obviously, the semantics of attaching to, right? So, custom, like the whole double matching thing, right, is an issue. But so I'd rather, like, clearly we need to attach the waypoint, right? I don't think there's any disagreement about that. You can do service-specific selection by putting a rule in too, right? So that's sufficient to meet the requirement, and is the case today anyway.
Yep.
Right. So we have no regression. If I was going to attach to anything else next, I would attach to service, not route. Right? Like there's this kind of hierarchy of specificity, right?
Attaching the service is problematic. That's really the problem, because in the gateway specification, you attach to something in the gateway, not to the backend that is selected, because that's post route.
I would say that in Ingress, that is post route and problematic. In Waypoint, it's not. Right. In Waypoint, a route augments a service because it's kind of gamma. So to me, that works perfectly fine. In the Ingress case, I would agree. It sounds like Louis, you would do a route there.
Yeah, you would have to do the two condition for that.
Yeah. I mean, you could say it's only route for Waypoint 2, but then you may end up in a case where you have to make a no-op route that's like send service foo to service foo, do nothing just as a policy attachment point. So we could easily support both.
Right. It seems logically more complicated, right? Like, you said you wanted to attach the lister, right, Costin? So the next thing would be to attach to like within the gateway, you would attach to a listener, but that's not specific enough either, right? Because port or port name wouldn't really work.
To clarify, I mean, I was not aware that we are moving Waypoint to use parent ref. I mean, kind. I thought it's a gateway, so it's kind gateway with a gateway CRD and. Did it change, John?
Oh, it is a gateway. I'm not sure what the question is, though. I mean, it is a gateway. So what's
attached to service? So you gamma. So if it's gamma, then parent ref of Waypoint will be a service or a list of services, or I don't know what.
If it's okay, so you create a gateway, and a gateway creates a Waypoint deployment. Now, within that, there's a number of services that are exposed through that gateway. So you could attach to those services, or you could make routes which augment how the service behaves, and you could attach to those. I think both are valid.
But from API perspective, I mean, if you take the gateway API, you have a gateway CRD, and you have a vendor resource that attaches to the gateway CRD. You attach to, you have section name, kind, and name. There is no such thing as service attachment when you attach to gateway.
The gateway API says you can attach to whatever you want, and the implementation decides what that means, right? So we can attach to gateway, which means apply to everything on the waypoint. We can attach to service, which means to request matching that service. We can attach to route, which means potentially the whole service or potentially a subset of the service, right?
I'm worried a bit about this because it's again tied to how we implement Envoy, and it will prevent other implementation of gateway to work nicely with this.
Why is it tied to Envoy? It feels like we actually made this decision specifically to not tie to Envoy because we thought we could only implement the old way in Envoy.
If I take an Nginx gateway and use it as a waypoint, assuming implement HPON, what will be the requirement besides, having authorization policies that attaches to the gateway?
So there has always been in every design of Ambient that you're not going to take drop-in gateway like Nginx. Like it's going to need to be a kind of gamma gateway that is aware of services and pods in the namespace. Now you can make a controller that configures Nginx to do it, but I would never expect any other gateway to be a drop-in replacement. They can be programmed to do it, but none of them are going to out of the box. It's not just a standard ingress gateway, right? It has specific waypoint semantics.
I'm not sure I see this.
Costin, are you trying to standardize authorization policy in Gamma? Because that's a different thing than making the existing Istio authorization policy work today.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to do, to say that authorization policy should be a gateway Gamma authorization policy that works with everything and should not be defined in ways that is specific to Ambient or to Istio.
Okay, so I don't know if we could take the existing authorization policy and just standardize it as is for Gamma. Like, it's a reasonable basis for it, but that's a very different conversation than make the existing Istio authorization policy and use cases work with Gamma.
No, that's
Right.
the end goal. And the end goal will be to have a common API that is defined for authorization policies that works with any gateway, any Gamma. It has a semantic, and we don't have to invent something that
Okay,
is
but
only.
that's going to take a year.
But
Minimum.
that's not what we're trying to achieve on this call, and this may not be like all the parties you need to involve too, right? You need to
Not
involve other
necessarily.
vendors.
I mean,
So-
we can start a vendor API following the stuff. We can go into a direction which is incompatible with what the current definition of attachment is, and define some issue specific, or we can define a vendor that is kind of neutral and could work with others.
As John said, there's nothing here. Like, if we allowed attachment to service or attachment to route or some other resource type, including things that were not in the core gateway spec itself, it's still valid, right? Parent ref is allowed to refer to anything. But trying to because then we're trying to balance the requirements expressed within the capabilities of Istio authorization policy with the attachment mechanism, right? And there would be a different set of decisions maybe if we're trying to standardize it, right, as part of Gamma itself.
Yeah, maybe. I think it's still okay because other vendors may define waypoints. I mean, if they want to do Nginx as a waypoint and they can use their own authorization API,
Right.
it will work the same as long as they put the labels how it's detected as, hey, this is a gateway.
Yeah. So this is still the Istio API,
Okay.
and based on Istio's choice for its gateway, not the Gamma choice for authorization policy. But we can propose it and try to say, look, the Istio one's a good basis for that. But I don't think we're trying to do that right now.
To take a step back, my goal finally is to not have the restrictions that John mentions, that you must have something very special as a waypoint. Other vendors like Google or someone else could have another implementation of gateways that can be used as internal load balancers that can, satisfy all the requirements that the waypoint would have.
Right, they can choose to implement the Istio authorization policy API or not.
Or not, yes, exactly. So basically they have an option to create waypoints that are not necessarily bound to Istio policies. That's fine.
Yeah, like that part's fine, I think.
Okay, cool. Sounds like we are okay. I do have a question. I want to have us think through waypoint upgrades, right? So I envision when I need to have two versions of waypoints for rolling, Canary revision-based upgrade, I assume down the road we would support that, right? So in that case, with parent ref, as a user, I don't want to change my authorization policy to necessarily point out to, I'm enforced this only on waypoint dash revision 1. I'm enforced this on waypoint dash revision 2. I would expect my authorization policy continue to be working unchanged as I bring up maybe multiple revisions of my waypoint.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's why following gateway model is better. But
but I'm trying to understand that, just making sure I'm not missing something. If we're just referring to the name of the gateway, now when I deploy multiple revision of my gateway, would that mean I would have waypoint revision 1 and waypoint revision 2 for multiple revisions?
I don't think we deploy multiple versions of the gateways. The deployment may be revision, but the gateway object will stay the same because that's attached to the load balancer, the service, and the static IP and whatever. So gateway.
So we would have maybe a revision in under the spec field, but then the name stays the same when you.
I think the name must stay the same because otherwise IP address, you lose the IP address if we revision the service itself. But the deployments underneath hidden could have versions themselves as deployments, not the gateway itself.
Okay. Yeah, so if our controller can spin up the new revision based on the same name, but just based on the version differences, yeah, that would solve that concern.
John, a quick question. If the authorization policy has no selector today, do we infer a parent ref selector?
But today that means it applies to the whole namespace. I think I mentioned how we should do it in here, but I forget what the answer was. I think it was something like we won't allow that on waypoints because then it's ambiguous whether it applies to a waypoint or the Z tunnel. The issue, though, is that makes it problematic with ingress, which is...
Yeah.
So I think we were going, I believe I said that any Kubernetes gateway, that applies. But for Istio gateway, it does not, because we can kind of break compatibility with the Kubernetes gateway because it's not stable yet. But
yeah,
by the time we ship this, that may not be true.
Right, there was some analysis done to see whether authorization policies actually had selectors in them, right?
Oh yeah,
Like
John,
typical...
you sent a question there a while back, I remember, but not many response.
Yeah, barely any response. The issue though is that part of this is we want to clearly know whether a policy is intended for Z tunnel or waypoint, because we treat them differently with the L4 aspect. So.
Oh, okay. All right, so the thing we're going to ask users to do is say, for a hypothetical upgrade, if you have an authorization policy and it's all L7, you have to go through and put the waypoint selector in to make it effective. So that's the work we're going to ask the user to do. Now we could maybe offer them a tool to do it, but they have to go through and update all the resources.
Yeah. Oh, and now that I'm looking at it, sorry, it's been a long time since I looked at this doc. I think the final option that I had, like this is the appendix with all the options. If you go to the top, there's actually talks about adding a new field as well. That's protocol. That specifies whether it's TCP only or HTTP, which helps classify whether it's for a Z tunnel or waypoint. So I think actually the idea of that namespace wide ones don't apply to the waypoint maybe outdated. But I have to go read through this again. I really forget what we had settled on. I mean, we didn't settle on anything, but we had tentatively.
So that's pretty important, right? That's probably the biggest usability issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, like I believe the summary is like if you want a policy to apply to Z tunnel, you actually explicitly mark it as TCP, and that's basically it.
Yeah, but that would change into being, if you have a parent ref to a gateway, which is the HTTP, then. So I think using the gateway API is the right solution here because it's a clear signal for the users that they're in a different world. They're using a gateway, they create a gateway resource and so forth.
Yeah, but for Z tunnel policies, they're per workload, and the gateway API doesn't currently have any way to attach policies to specific workloads. So unless we define that, then the workload selector is kind of the best we have.
Yeah.
Right. That Z tunnel is like you'd have to name a Z tunnel after each of the workloads, right? That's kind of pointless.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a discussion that we definitely need to have again, maybe about if we want to keep, adopt network policy for L7, which is a standard for Kubernetes, first of all, not break it, and second, support it. And encourage people to use network policy with an extension for identity, because a label selectors that selects service account or some namespace or something similar, because it's very confusing. especially if we break network policy in some cases.
Okay, so John, on the protocol selection front, in a lot of cases we can infer the protocol from the conditions, right, in the policy. It's not great, but it mostly works, right? Right, and it's okay if we double enforce a policy. Right, if a policy is L4 and it's implemented by both the waypoint and the Z-tunnel, that's probably okay.
That is okay, yes.
But when would this happen, Louis? Because if all the waypoints are defined as having parent ref,
Well, no, so this is the upgrade problem, right? If we want to shield users from the upgrade pain, and an authorization policy has no selector at all, we can apply it to both.
yeah, I don't think automatic upgrade is realistic, feasible, or something that will ever happen.
Yeah, so that's the real question here, is are we okay telling users to do work, and what work are we willing to tell, like, or is it okay to ask them to do? If the answer is, look, if you're using workload selectors, which means also if you're using no selector at all, it's Z-tunnel only, which means every policy is treated as L4. And only if you do a waypoint selector do you get an L7 policy, right? That's a difficult thing for a user to absorb because almost all of their authorization policies are L7 anyway, right? So it kind of works against the current typical use case. Even if it's the logical right answer, it's kind of working against the user a bit.
Yes, but semantics will change, cluster local will change, because there is gateway API, there is gamma, and especially if we combine foundation as well, it's already a huge...
Right, but today, like, just creating a waypoint is a marker interface, right? Like, it's a very low overhead thing to do as a user. This is actually the harder thing. Like, everything else kind of works when you create a waypoint resource. Just the authorization policy binding. So,
Well, also
what
all the
matters?
other binding APIs, right? But authorization is harder. So.
Like, and it's the most widely used one.
Yeah.
Like virtual service and all that stuff work, right? Once you create a waypoint. So we have to decide if can we have a existing usage friendly upgrade or not, right, with the API.
I would say, even regardless of if we have or not, we should not degrade the API and semantics of Ambient to make it easier for this one-time transition. So if it is possible, wonderful. If it's not possible, that's okay. Probably users will migrate, but I wouldn't, mess up the API just because to make it the transition easier.
This was all a great discussion. I am having a hard time concretely telling what people want, what people in this call want or don't want. If we can comment on the doc, whether we like what's in the doc or what we want changed, I think it would be really helpful to make this a bit more concrete. I will do the same myself because I wrote this 2 months ago. I don't know if I agree with it anymore. So.
Yeah, so let's recircle back on this topic next week then, because it's the most important one. Yeah.
Do we need an answer, even an imperfect one, for the alpha?
No, I think the alpha is kind of shipped now. It's done. So
yeah.
What happened in alpha?
In alpha, we said that you would do a label selector matching the waypoint. So it's in some ways equivalent to the parent ref, but not syntactically. So we will break that. And we have kind of established that we will be breaking changes in the alpha to beta transition.
Oh, we could support both too, right? If you want to select the waypoint, you just explicitly
we agreed we were going to have
it.
no issues with making breaking changes, right?
All right. So that ship has sailed. Because we could try and spend some time on it today and see if we can get on. Like, that's the most impactful thing I can think of, right? And if we can get close to what our beta answer is in alpha, that is probably good from a user feedback standpoint. I don't know.
From a user perspective, beyond upgrades, the more APIs we have that behave differently if a waypoint exists or if it doesn't, the more pressure I think we have to automatically create the waypoint on the user's behalf. In other words, in order to enable L7 auth, you have to create an L7 auth policy, and then you have to go create this completely unrelated API object that has no connection to the policy.
Well, the policy literally references it in this proposal, so it's actually.
I thought we were saying reference the route.
Oh, that's true. We were saying potentially references multiple things. So in the route case, you're right.
And the route does not reference the gateway. The route references a service. So there's no way to like crawl.
Right, but we don't have that feature today, Mitch.
Okay.
Right, so that's not an upgrade concern.
Yeah, no, I'm not
right,
so much of upgraded long-term user experience, not asking our users to repeat themselves.
Right, I mean, the more extreme answer here is, look, 99% of authorization policies are L7. Ignore the selector in upgrade. Right, just completely ignore it and say it applies, always. And then deal with it, like, because what will happen is you'll get some traffic conflicts. You won't have, like, if you're writing the policies in a reasonable way anyway, you're probably not really going to experience anything, right? So, like, the simplest upgrade policy is all authorization policies are applied to the waypoint. That's it. And the workload selector is meaningless. And that probably actually works most of the time.
But you have to know which waypoint to apply, else you could apply 1,000 authorization policy, which
No.
99% doesn't apply.
But then we can add that, Lynn, right?
And you use the same thing for gateways because you have ingress gateways, and ingress gateways hopefully will start using the gateway API, and authorization policy will apply to parent ref. So you have consistent experience for waypoints, ingress gateway, and eventually egress gateways. So I don't see a problem with using proper Kubernetes APIs as they are defined.
Yeah, so I mean, John, what do you think? Could we just say, look, authorization policies are applied by all the waypoints, and if you add parent ref, then it's applied by the specific one, and that's it. And we ignore workload selector completely if a waypoint is enabled.
That's what I think the doc says.
Yeah,
I think so.
That's my
Unless I'm not
understanding
understanding what
too,
you're saying.
yeah.
yeah, I'm not comfortable with this because parent ref is required in Gamma, and then it kind of prevents. I mean, my goal is to have full compatibility with the if Gamma say or sorry, if Gateway API says that you don't have a require a parent ref and it applies to everything, then I'm okay. But that's not what the upstream API is saying.
Right, but we're not trying to standardize this API custom, right?
But also, we don't want to invent another thing that it's Istio specific and off from everything else. And when people start using other implementations, they will have to, Istio does it in this weird way, doesn't require parent ref. And I don't know. It's we have enough complex confusion and Istio weird ways to do things that are incompatible with Kubernetes.
Right, but like the tension here is with the upgrade for the massive usage of Istio authorization policy.
I kind of don't think that the upgrade or migration are kind of the long-term important thing. I mean, long-term is to have compatibility and consistency with other implementation with Kubernetes and a clean API that is upgrade is one time. I mean, it's fine.
If and when Gamma standardizes an authorization policy API, which will not be the Istio one, it may look like it, but it won't be it, then that can happen.
But we standardize already on how to attach policies to gateways. That's parent ref. So if we use a gateway API for creating the waypoint, I think it's reasonable to expect that policies will attach the way gateway defines them, which is parent ref. I'm okay if we just choose to if we don't specify parent ref, we do some Istio specific thing, and whatever happens.
Right, that's literally what I'm saying. Right, it's like if there's no parent ref and you have the resource, what does it mean?
It means you're using Istio, not Ambient. I mean, Istio v1, not Ambient.
Well, no, it means you're using Istio, not Gamma.
Or you don't know, or we don't know.
Right, so that like we have to pick an answer.
Once the user make sure that if there is no sidecar, it's rejected, because we also have the case where you may have migrate from sidecars, and then how do you know which? It's very, very complicated to do a migration and not know what it's applying to. I mean, maybe it was they intended to apply to sidecar and someone applied waypoint accidentally, or they're migrating. I don't know. It seems confusing versus something very clear cut.
right? But we have this issue, right? Like we have to pick something, right? And so what's the one that's most likely to yield the right outcome, and how do we give them a roadmap to get a precise outcome?
Yeah, I think parent ref is the correct answer for being precise, being explicit, and yes, it requires.
Yeah,
but
I know that, right? So, but we still have to pick something that gives them a default outcome during an upgrade that is at least likely to work.
Alert, reject, don't. You keep injecting sidecars until they put parent ref. I mean, if they don't have parent ref, they're in the limbo state where we don't know what they need.
Well, if they choose to use parent ref, we honor that. If they don't have any selector, we just apply to all the waypoints in that particular namespace or globally, right? If that authorization policy is global, right, it would apply to all the waypoints.
If I wanted to be safe, if I in a namespace I didn't see this parent ref, I would interpret it as, hey, the user wrote an authorization policy for sidecars with sidecar in mind. They don't know that they're using Ambient because someone else maybe created this, because they're independent developers.
Well, I would apply to all the waypoints because we don't enforce. What if I'm having namespace based scoped waypoint, right? I don't necessarily need to point to a particular waypoint.
No, I say I would inject the sidecar basically. So if you have an authorization policy,
we know we don't want to do that. Right? That's the one thing we know we don't want to do. The user said they wanted to use a waypoint for their namespace. We don't want to turn on sidecar injection.
If you label the namespace, we do have sidecars. I mean, it's perfectly valid to
have. But like the whole point of the exercise is to get them off of that. So, right, we have some choices. If there's none, it means all. I don't know if that's violating the gateway. Like Gamma probably doesn't say anything about this.
And that's consistent with the Istio's authority policy today, right? If I'm not using any label selector, that means apply to whichever scope I'm applying to, whether it's namespace or global. Yeah.
Second option, we make you do the work, right? Which is like, look, workload selector only works with sidecars. Right? If you're going to use a waypoint, you have to attach it to the waypoint. So you got to go through each of your resources and do that.
Yeah, let's think about it. Let's think about it and consider, because it's
okay.
Yeah, I mean, the more I think about it, I think I like the parents ref more. And then John, I don't know if you remember, I think Keith, you actually commented on one of the issues that Lena raised. Actually, I'm just going to send the issues here so everybody can read it offline too. So basically, we need a way to differentiate the layer 4 authorization policy and layer 7. And today, I think zTunnel is not implementing that because we couldn't tell which authorization policy. So by reference bind ref to the waypoint, we would be able to tell.
I think how it works right now is that if you have a waypoint and the request is from the waypoint, we just don't enforce anything on zTunnel, which we would like to do the second layer of enforcement. And if you don't have a waypoint, we apply all the policies, which may be L7 ones, and an L7 policy will never match. And so you will, depending on what you write, allow versus denied, you potentially will just make it so all traffic's denied when you don't want that. But that's part of why the doc has the explicit protocol selection. So we have very clear delineation of TCP policies applied to zTunnel. We'll reject any time you put HTTP, so you can't possibly make a mistake. And then we have both layers, waypoint and zTunnel. We can apply both policies in one request. So we have kind of defense in depth and even network policies, right? So there's kind of 3 layers of authorization policy potentially on a given request.
Okay, so even with reference ref, we don't necessarily be able to tell because the reference ref could be omitted, right? If it's a namespace scope.
Exactly. That's why you have protocol.
Yeah.
So to be a zTunnel
Gotcha.
policy, you have to put protocol equals TCP and not have a parent ref.
Yeah, got you. Okay, I see.
I'll put some more examples on the doc. I think it's explained, but it's kind of hard to follow the text. So I'll put some YAMLs.
Okay. All right, well, we should probably wrap up the meeting and take this over to the doc.
Yeah. let's rediscuss this again next week and offline too. Thanks everybody.